Hello there, welcome to video number 13 and really video number 1 in our new unit, the Modernization of Quebec Society. In today's video, we transition now from the effects of World War I and the second phase of industrialization, and we begin to look now at society during the economic crisis, the stock market crash of 1929, the effects into the 1930s with the Great Depression, and then we begin to look at some of the ways in which the government of Quebec and in Canada, the federal government, had to step in to provide assistance to the country. Today's essential question is, how did the state intervene in society in the 1930s? In order to indicate that you can answer that question, you must be able to answer our success criteria, which are that I can indicate the measures introduced by the government in the social sector during the Great Depression, that you can indicate measures that were taken by the government following the economic crisis of the 30s, and that you can identify measures introduced by the Quebec government to promote development in regions. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and let's get started. Experienced spectacular economic growth in the 1920s. Big cities like Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver grew rapidly, and as of this decade, the urban population outnumbered the rural population, meaning people were really living in big cities. Industrial production in the West, particularly the United States, increased significantly to meet the demand of consumer goods. Canada's pulp and paper industry was booming, holding a 64% share of the world market in 1929. Its metal industry, which required huge amounts of energy, led to the development of hydroelectricity. By the early 1930s, almost 7 out of 10 Canadian homes already had electricity. Most of these were located in urban areas. Industrial production and economic growth allowed families with enough income to buy new consumer goods, such as automobiles and electric household appliances. Arts and culture flourished in the 1920s, and Montreal transmitted the first radio broadcast in North America in 1920. The carefree 1920s came to an abrupt end on October 24, 1929. On this day, known as Black Thursday, stock prices plummeted at the New York Stock Exchange. The stock market crash of 1929 marked the beginning of a worldwide financial and economic crisis, resulting in many bankruptcies and the loss of countless jobs. In the following decade, Canada's unemployment rate soared. The repercussions of this unprecedented crisis called into question the role of the state. Federal and provincial governments had to now intervene in order to help and alleviate some of the effects of the Depression. At the beginning of the Depression, there was neither employment insurance nor social assistance. The most destitute had to turn to religious groups to provide charitable organizations, so hundreds of thousands of people ate in soup kitchens and lived in crowded, tiny lodgings. Overwhelmed by the number of people who required assistance, charities and religious groups were no longer able to help all those people in need. And at first, the federal and provincial governments refused to intervene because they believed that the situation was only temporary. Unfortunately, the situation only got worse. After some months of hesitation, the provinces began to pressure the federal government to act, even though social issues were the province's responsibility. So provisionary solutions were found by the different levels of government. In 1931, Prime Minister Bennett's government passed the Unemployment Relief Act. So this meant the federal government, working with provincial and municipal governments, invested in public works to create jobs for the unemployed. The unemployed could work in bridge construction and building renovations. Other funds were allocated for direct relief. As the conditions began to grow worse and worse, as can be seen in the images above, the federal government began to spend a little bit of money in order to provide relief for the people living in Canada. Two ways in which the government provided relief during the Depression was through public works projects, as can be seen here. Basically, a public work project is a government-funded project that has to do with public buildings like hospitals, bridges, infrastructure, transportation, roads, government buildings. And so individuals were being given jobs at that time in order to make a little bit of money. Unfortunately, it was only for a mere few cents per day. Another way in which the government was providing relief was something called direct relief. And direct relief was essentially an idea that was put in place where financial aid would be given to some families, first in the form of goods, so food, and then they would start to provide them with checks to subsidize basic needs like lodging, clothing, heat, and food. And so this financial service, people were being given unemployment insurance. So in the 1930s, the unemployment rate in Canada climbed to 30%. And so that meant that basically 1 in every 5 Canadians had to depend upon the government for financial assistance. So once again, the federal government did two things during the Depression. One was direct relief, and the second was public works projects. So another way in which the government mildly intervened was through unemployment relief camps. A relief camp, as can be seen here, basically were camps set up in rural areas where single unemployed men from urban centers would be recruited to be brought out to do work for a merely 20 cents a day in terrible working conditions. And it became very, very clear that public works projects, these relief camps, as well as through direct relief, these measures were not sufficient, and so the federal and provincial governments were basically slowly forced to admit that they needed to intervene in a much more supportive way in the country's economy if they were to avoid future depressions. And so what this basically was that a policy that meant the government would have to intervene more in economic and social affairs in tough times was put in place. And that was basically a concept or a policy known as interventionism. Thanks again for watching video 13 in our Flipped Classroom series. Before we go, let's just be reminded of our essential question, which was, how did the state intervene in society during the 1930s? Be sure to be able to answer our success criteria for today, which were to indicate the measures introduced by the government in the social sector during the Great Depression, that you can indicate measures taken by the government following the economic crisis of the 1930s, and finally that you would be able to identify certain measures that were introduced by the Quebec government to promote development in regions. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.